This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Slitska. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by Dr. Nalda Wainwright. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Nalda.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Angelica. It's great to be here.
So Dr. Nalda is Associate Professor of Health and Physical Literacy at the University of Wales, Trinity, St. David. And today our discussion will be centered around the motor skills gap in children's development on a global scale, really. So it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about your research to begin with.
Yeah, so my research going back as far as sort of 2010, I was looking at doctoral level research in the field of physical literacy, and we had obviously the excitement of the new curriculum in Wales at that time, which was the foundation phase in early childhood, so a very play-based curriculum. So that research was really looking at how does this very active play-based curriculum, which emphasizes the use of the outdoors, support physical literacy in early childhood. And we expected to see that it was really good for the support of physical literacy, that it was giving children lovely holistic movement experiences, very play-based, very child-centered, which it was. But we were really surprised when we did the analysis of children's physical skills that we saw a real gap in a certain group of these skills called object control skills, and we didn't expect to see that. So working with colleagues from the States, we were diving down to look at, what was going on with the children's motor skill development. And what we discovered was that the teachers and preschool staff didn't know how to intervene, how to teach these skills. And object control skills are a group of motor skills which need to be taught. So there are different categories of motor skills, and our locomotor skills, which are running, jumping, skipping, hopping, traveling from A to B. They're very common to all humans on Earth. They're what we call phylogenetic. So that means that if we do enough of playing and physical activity and have those opportunities, children will develop proficiency in those skills. But object control skills are kind of culturally specific. So in different cultures, different countries in the world, the object control skills will be different, and they're not like a survival skill. So they need to be taught. And the world of motor development research has researched for many, many decades how children develop these skills, what stages they go through, and how we set up environments and equipment to teach them. But it's very much been a research field, not one that would be part of teacher education, wouldn't be part of physical education preparation, not even at primary age, which is my background, was a primary age PE specialist. Okay. So it wasn't in there. And thinking back sort of how we lived in society, I think it was because children were naturally being taught those skills by playing out. So if you think back years ago, children would get home from school, they'd be straight out the door, they'd be playing for hours on end, but not just with children in their own class from school of the same age. They would be playing with all the children in the community, their extended family, older children. So when they were out playing for hours, those older children were modeling the skills and in effect teaching them. So children weren't coming into the school system unable to do these skills. So it wasn't needed for anyone to teach it. And it's only really been looked at and analysed through a research lens, really. So when we went back into the very qualitative data in our research in these schools, and these were schools that were recognised for being very good at the play-based curriculum, so we knew the children were being very active and having a range of opportunities. What we saw is that the teachers didn't have the skills to analyse those stages of development in those specific motor skills, and as such weren't then able to set up the right kinds of environments, the right tasks with the right equipment to teach those children the skills. So it's very like this. If we think about reading, we wouldn't expect children, if we just threw a bag of letters on the floor and said, play with those letters, expect you to learn to read. We have to set up.
Naturally pick it up.
Yeah, and we know that won't happen. We know that as teachers, we have to analyse the children's cues. What do they use already? How do we encourage them to use a range of cues? And those motor skills are the same. We have to analyse where they are developmentally and then look at what do we put in place to help them learn those skills. So we were sort of like, oh, wow, we didn't expect this. So what are we going to do about it? Because there are actually worryingly really big consequences of children not developing these skills in early childhood. So we know from developmental models that have been research from way back in the 80s that if children don't become what we call proficient in their motor skills in that early childhood window, then they can't access later physical activity and sport. And what's most concerning about the object control skills is we know that children that have better levels of object control skills are more active through the school day, and more active generally. And also good object control skills in early childhood predict adolescent physical activity. So when we're in a situation which we are now with, I think the World Health Organization have quoted 80% of adolescents are not reaching physical activity guidelines,
wow,
then
that's
we can see
huge.
a concern. Yeah. And, you know, for us in the field of motor development, we were going back, this data was collected in 2010, 2011, and we've seen a decline in those motor skills in children year on year on year from then. So as a result of that, we were sort of thinking, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And our colleagues in the States had developed a program for intervening in areas of deprivation. So we also know that in areas of socioeconomic deprivation, children are highly likely to be delayed in their motor skills through a lack of opportunities and equipment and or a whole range of things. So they had over many decades been developing a program called Successful Kinesthetic Instruction for Preschoolers. Our colleague, Professor Jackie Goodway from Ohio State University, had been working on that with her doctoral students, saying, if we go into these areas where children are really, really chronically delayed, can we put in a program of instruction which will bring those children out of delay? So they've been researching that and seeing time and time again in different areas, they could put in, if they put in this lovely structured approach to physical development instruction, the children would come out of delay. And once they're out of delay, children are more likely then to engage in physical activity. The more they engage in it, the more they'll keep on developing the skills. So it becomes a sort of positive spiral of engagement rather than that negative one. So we worked with Professor Goodway and we're like, oh my goodness, we've got this gap in these schools in Wales. What are we going to do? And she's like, oh, well, let's have a look at the principles of the skip. So we worked with Jackie. She came over from the States and we said, we haven't got a whole team of PhD kinesiology students to go out into the schools, clearly, or the preschools and run this program. So we need to develop something that our early years practitioners and our early childhood foundation phase staff can take, and they can develop and support the children with these skills in their settings. And actually, you know, if you think about it, who is the best person to teach those children is the person that works with them day in, day out, because they know those children and they're familiar with them. So really, it was about being able to give the teachers those skills of analysis of the children's movement in the same way they would for literacy, numeracy, and other areas of the curriculum, but seeing it through a physical lens. So we worked on a program of skip, but with a very much a play-based approach. So we had to fit in our play-based curriculum. So it couldn't be very much, we couldn't have this sort of drill and skill approach that you might see in sort of formal sport settings. That, you know, we needed to make sure it was developmentally appropriate for the curriculum. And so we developed a program called Skip. So Skip, which is a shortened version of Successful Kinesthetic Instruction for Preschoolers, because time to say that.
It's long.
Yeah, and because it's in Wales, the Welsh word for Wales is Cymru. So we have a program called Skip Cymru. And we were really super lucky because we managed then to get some European funding for full-time PhD study to say, well, we've got this in principle, we've looked at this and tested it in schools at an initial phase, and we were able to put in a full-time PhD student to go out to look at how that was being rolled out. Could teachers develop it and use this consistently in the classroom? Could they affect the change in the children in their class? If we train them, can they make the difference to the children's outcomes? And what we can say is, 100% they can do that. The children's skills improved, brought them out of delay. What we did see, though, we had sort of a one-day training with mentoring. We saw that was really inconsistent. So we further as the results of that big study with that European funding, we were able then to develop a very more in-depth program where it's accredited training. So we rolled out something that gives teachers workshops and online learning so they can really understand why they have a really important role to play in those early years to lay foundations. So physical literacy is a lifelong concept. So if we get it right in early childhood, we lay those foundations, young children become confident and think they're a mover. They like to move, they choose to move, they've got the skills to move, and they start to value movement and see it as part of who they are. And that's really, physical literacy should carry on then right through the life course into old age. But it's it's this early childhood piece that is absolutely critical, and it's critical for a range of reasons. It's critical from the psychological perspective because we know that early childhood window is a time when children are not accurate at judging their self-perception. So any of your listeners that are familiar with Susan Harter's work on the perception of the self will have heard of this perceived physical competence as one of those self-perceptions. And that physical self-perception will drive our global self-esteem and drive whether we choose to be active or not, whether we see ourselves as a mover. And luckily for us in the work we do, children in those early years up to age of about 6 or 7 are very inaccurate at judging whether they're good or not. And they think, don't they, that if we praise them a lot, they're great at moving. If they've tried hard, they're great. So it gives us this fantastic window when they're really excited and willing to take part to make sure that we give them the skills and that we get them into that lovely positive upward spiral of engagement in physical activity, which keeps them on a very positive health trajectory as well. Because the other piece that is really important, and not to put too much pressure on early childhood, but we know that's where it all happens.
Yeah.
If these children that we're seeing with these chronic delays are the children that are opting out of 7, and we've seen in the media over the last sort of 6 to 8 years, we see stories coming out every now and then about children age 7 opting out of physical activity. And it's like, well, yeah, of course, because if we haven't got them to be a proficient mover in these basic skills and given them a lovely broad movement vocabulary by 7 or 8, they're going to start looking at themselves and realizing whether they're good or not. And then if they compare themselves to their friends and they're not good as their friends, they're going to opt out. And if we put them into more structured sport situations and they're not ready, they're going to opt out. And those children will enter a downward spiral. And we're seeing it, aren't we? We're seeing it over 2/3 of children not participating in enough physical activity, children who are sedentary, gaining weight, primary school children with type 2 diabetes. It's like these are all consequences of not getting the movement right in early childhood. So for us, that, it started many, many years ago with saying, oh gosh, no object control skills. But it was almost like we sort of lifted the lid on this, and it's like, wow, this is absolutely critical.
It's huge.
We see from the work done from global work in motor development research, there are models that show the relationship between the physical activity, the motor skills, the self-perception in early childhood, and they show how that drives this positive health activity trajectory or negative. But for us, the really important message, I guess, is that we've got this window of opportunity. It's the age where, if we look at normal child development, they should be becoming proficient movers in that time. So by the time they're about 7 to 9, they should be proficient in a whole range of movement skills, which include those object control skills, but are also a lovely broad movement vocabulary. And if we get that right in that window, what we get are those children who are really confident to move. They see themselves as a mover. They're happy to engage. They're ready, if they're proficient, to be put into slightly more structured sport-like scenarios, which if they're not proficient, they shouldn't be put into those sporting situations. So it puts pressure on, again, the early years window, the early childhood piece, but it's what children are ready to be doing anyway. And I guess for us, it's really exciting working with both teachers and practitioners, because they come back and they go, oh wow, that it's absolutely transformed my practice. I didn't realize how important all that rich movement and play was. I didn't understand how much I had to make sure that children were crawling. I didn't know how important balance was. So those are really key things that have a massive influence on the whole of the child's development and are absolutely critical for those later skills, like object control skills. If you've got to have that good balance piece.
So when we talk about object control skills, you say that's what children need to develop for later life, but actually they still need to develop that in the early years to use in early years, right? So they need to be able to use those object control skills when they are still between like 0 to 5. And what are those? What do those skills look like in practice? So can you give us some examples of exactly what you mean?
Yeah. So if we think of our children coming from birth right through development, what we want to do is make sure that we are laying really solid foundations for movement. And obviously they build on each other, don't they? So I think a real shock to a lot of the staff and people we work with is how vital those early experiences of like tummy time, rolling over, sitting up, crawling are, in terms of the fact that they are wiring. And people will have heard of sensory, I guess, the sensory motor integration piece, but they perhaps weren't aware of how much that leads on to those later skills and underpins them. So for example, of a vestibular system, which we know is in our inner ear, that's our balance system. Well, when a baby is doing those very, very early tummy time pieces, lifting their head even on a shoulder when they're newborn, that's the very beginning of that baby's relationship with gravity. They're already starting to learn, where am I in relation to gravity? And if that baby then can't hold its head up straight and control its head and neck and control its eyes, it can't eye track, it can't have good contact with their carer's face and read facial expression. They start to lose that ability to read non-verbal communication because they can't keep a focus on their caregiver's eyes. And we know we've developed from top down. So it's the first bit they get control of, then their neck and shoulders. So that tummy time is vital, isn't it, for building that strength across the back or the shoulders, which later enables a child to sit up. If a child can sit up and be stable, they can reach and grab other things. So they get access to all that other beautiful sensory input. And all the time, that sensory input is wiring the brain and wiring those systems. And that sitting up and holding themselves up develops core stability. And stability actually underpins all voluntary movement later on. So even if we roll that forward to the baby's learned to sit up, they've learned to crawl. And I'm sure you've had other speakers who've talked about the importance of crawling for wiring the brain, but it's also crawling in terms of foundations for later movement, because crawling is a multi-limb cross-lateral action. So it's already starting to wire those pathways in the brain that are going to be used later for, if you think about a run is a multi-limb cross-lateral action. So the arms are doing something in opposition to the legs, a bit like a crawl or a climbing action. So all of those very early movement, baby movements, toddler movements, are actually really significant in those foundations for later. And then if we think of that, we transfer that into those manipulation skills. So let's take the example of like a cat. So we can't just pin it down to like a handful of skills and say it's a broad vocabulary. But if we take the example of a catch, for example, we think if a child's going to catch a ball, just in order to catch, they've got to be able to be stable first. So they've got to be able to stand, they've got to be able to balance on two legs, they've got to be able to see the ball coming towards them and track it as it comes towards them. Then they've got to be able to have hand-eye coordination that goes out to reach forward and be timed for as the ball's coming towards them, reaching. So when you think of all of those complex systems that are involved just in a simple catch, it's not a simple skill at all. So,
when you really break it down, it's actually really complicated. And obviously we don't notice that, and we take it for granted, the fact that we already know how to do that as adults. And actually for children, they are learning all of these skills and stages from scratch. So like you said at the beginning, what you're saying is that they can't just learn this by just playing, by just being exposed to a learning environment. Actually, it does need instruction and understanding, or at least understanding what can we provide for the child in order to be able to learn this skill.
So what we do, so when we work with practitioners and teachers and our students, we say, okay, well, the first starting point, in the same way with other areas of children's learning, you start with where the child is, isn't it? Well, what can they do? So with a child, that we teach them what the stages would be of catching. And so they can see that if a child is in the initial stages, and if we throw we wouldn't use small objects because they won't be able to see them. They haven't got the good height, so you need a nice. So first we talk about what equipment is appropriate for children of that age. So big, soft, gentle, a ball. So if we threw that ball at a child, and the beginning stages would be what we call a delayed reaction. So the ball would actually hit them, and then they put their arms there and they would miss it. So would know from that. So with them, we're teaching people to say, well, if a child has a delayed reaction in their catching, what does that tell us about what's missing that they need to be able to do to be able to become good at catching? And the very first thing you'd say is, well, if it's hitting them before they put their arms there, they're not able to track the ball yet. So it doesn't matter how many times we throw a ball at them, they're not going to learn that. So we would look at, well, what activities can we set up for those children that are going to develop, first and foremost, eye tracking, because until they get that, they're not even ready for catching. So we might play games with scarves and balloons and rolling the ball to them.
See, so following the object like a scarf and looking at it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they're learning to track an object. They're learning to see it roll towards them. It's nice and slow, brightly coloured. They're playing games with balloons. So they're things that children at that age are appropriate for them to be playing, but it's about that practitioner or teacher going, oh, right, that's what I need to do to support the later skill of catching. And until we can do that, we won't be able to catch. And I guess because when we think about the holistic nature of these things, like I always wear my physical literacy lens, but it's holistic. But, you know, in early childhood, we probably see the most holistic version of movement ever, don't we? With child development.
Yeah,
it's like,
definitely.
So everything that child has experienced, if they're learning to track with a scarf and a balloon, they're going to be using eye tracking across all areas of their learning, aren't they? For everything they do. And we know that, you know, eye tracking is needed in reading. So all of them, it has a knock-on development, everything. And interestingly, from the research, what we see in the research is that children with the higher physical competence scores, so when we test children for their global physical competence, higher physical competence, they have higher academic outcomes. They score better in their academic performance. So in the study that we did a correlation across multiple tests, both academic and social. So we looked at the physical competence scores, and then we looked at reading age, spelling age, their maths scores, maths age. We also looked at their perception about self and school readiness. And what we saw was that there was a direct correlation between the physical scores. And if you look at the Millennium Cohort Study, you know, that's tracking children that were born in the year 2000, and then they release data. Well, their year 5 data reported on the relationship between physical competence and development, and they flipped it. We looked at higher scores related to higher scores, but what they saw was children with poorer physical competence scores had poor language and communication, poor academic outcomes, poor reading age. So, you know, it's not just the studies that we've done, that's kind of globally. There are direct relationships between, and it makes sense, doesn't it? Because
I was just going to say that too.
Yeah, how does all that wiring of the brain happen? If you look at literature around sensory integration, that very physical interaction with the world, that embodied in the world of physical literacy, they talk about that embodied interaction. It's that which is wiring the brain, isn't it? So it's laying all those beautiful neural pathways for children to be able to process. And I guess if we look at examples in Scandinavia where they don't tend to formalize learning as early as they do in, well, not in Wales, but in other parts of the UK. So they wouldn't have that formal introduction maybe to reading so early on. They have more play-based learning, more active, more outdoors. And yet if you look at their literacy scores later on, they're outperforming the other countries. And that's because they see the value in knowing that we have to lay these foundations you know, at this level with lovely, rich, physical, embodied experiences, if we're going to be ready for the higher order cognitive thinking that we need for processing, for reading, for numeracy later on. So that, you know, for us, we know that play-based, rich movement environment is super important, but there was the double whammy for us is like, oh my goodness, these children have not got the foundations for these skills, both locomotor or object control skills, and the implications for health later on are absolutely massive if we don't get these skills right. And it's a brand new problem. We started to see it clearly pre-COVID, and the global data is clear. It's not just our data in the Wales, it's across this data in the UK broadly, but also in America study, they did a whole cohort in 2019 and saw 77% of children delayed in their motor skills. So
I was going to say, why is it a brand new problem? Is it, you know, what you mentioned earlier in terms of children not playing outside as much anymore with different mixed age groups, and that's kind of the lack of those object control skills that they're learning. But there's lots of other reasons for that as well, isn't there, for that delayed physical development?
Yeah, I think there are specific reasons for delays in physical development. They've always been there. So, you know, you will always get children with coordination disorders. There's always a percent of children who would have more complex needs around learning those physical skills. Now that's just children all learn differently. But what we're seeing is a growth across a population of children that have got no specific reason for a delay in those skills. And as soon as we give them those opportunities, they are becoming proficient in them in a very short period of time. And so for us, the only explanation we can give for it at this point, and we can't obviously track back in time, is the change that we've got in society, the fact that potentially we're eroding that physical development right from birth with baby gadgets, pod seats, car seats, baby bouncers, all those. So all of that little, every day a child is probably a little bit more in a buggy, a little bit more on a screen, a little bit more in a pushchair. They're not going out to play. We're not seeing babies, pot on the floor on their tummy as much, so all of that erosion. And then so that stability piece, we see a lot of children with poor core stability that sit very wide on desks, that wrap legs, feet around the legs of chairs, that W sit on the floor. They haven't got that core stability before, coming into school. So it's that constant erosion, and the fact that these object control skills are not being, I guess, almost like a hand-me-down thing. So because they're cultural, they're the things that kids would tend to play outside after school. So for us in the UK, obviously things like football would dominate, wouldn't they? And you can imagine sort of think about in the sort of 1960s, these little kids out playing for hours after school. The little kid goes to kick and misses it, and the older kids, they're like, oh no, don't do it like this. Watch me. This is how you do it. Do it like this. And putting the ball down and modeling a proficient kick that they'd been modeled by older kids. And they, but that just doesn't happen. And the only place children are being exposed to these type of skills is in a very structured, formal sport environment. And unfortunately, if these are not the same skills as a skill that we see in a sport, we call those a sport technique. So for example, if we took a catching skill, to be proficient at catching in a generic basic catch that we would want to teach in the early years, that basically means a child is able to move into a space and catch a ball that's flying through the air towards them. So they don't have to stand here and catch it. Doesn't have to be a big soft ball. Any ball that they'll be able to move to it. And if a child can't do that, you think of any sport that involves catching, they all have to be able to catch a ball that isn't going to just land here and is gently popped on them. So until they can do that, they're not ready for it. And a catch looks different in every sport that you play. The catch becomes applied to that sport and is a sport technique. And they're very different. They're very different things. But until a child is proficient in those, which is why I'm sort of the opinion there, it's very much in a school or an earlier setting, it's the people that work with those children day in, day out, who know them. They need to be empowered to go, what you do for literacy numeracy, here's your physical glasses. Come and do it for the physical as well. And it's actually incredible because early years practitioners, teachers have very good pedagogy generally, because that's what they do. They just haven't had that pedagogy in a physical context. They haven't been shown, how do I analyze that movement and unpick it? And straight away they go, oh, that's not rocket science. That's great. But it's like, it really is like having a pair of physical development glasses. Put them on, they're like, oh, that's what you mean. Wow. And it takes a bit of time of him. We've seen that we need to do the training over a period of time. So they come and have a workshop, they have online support, online learning, and really interactive, but then they'll go away and they try some of the stuff that we did on the first workshop. So they build their confidence, because for a lot of people that, taking children into bigger groups in an open space or working with them on specific is overwhelming if that hasn't been what your experience has been. So, but very quickly by the second workshop, they're like coming back with going, oh, that was great. That worked really well. And they're sharing something they've done with other, and then we sort of feed them the next bit. Well, let's try and introduce these new activities in this way. And then there's like a third for the teachers, like a third workshop, so that they're doing like a professional. And because we accredit it, so for us in Wales, teachers with our new curriculum, they need to do professional learning as part of their job. So they're able to use that where they're looking, they're reading, they're understanding the theory, they're applying it in their practice, they're reflecting on that. So it becomes part of their professional learning. And it actually blows me away how amazing they become with just what it feels like. It's just that bit of knowledge that was missing early. I mean, and I work with students that will go on to hopefully be teachers and preschool teachers, and we make sure that all of our teacher education students get this now, because heads are saying, well, I'm sending teachers to learn this, but actually every student coming out, why isn't everyone taught this? Why doesn't everyone know this? And I guess they didn't know it because it didn't used to be an issue when society was different and children were way more physical. and way more playing out in a much less structured way with different age groups, you know.
Just a very quick and a very exciting announcement from me. The Voice of Early Childhood Conference is back. After the success of our first one, we have organised another one on the 16th of March, 2024. This will be a day full of learning, sparking reflections, sharing, discussing, and networking. Our overarching theme, which fits perfectly with the ethos of the Voice of Early Childhood, is advocacy, agency, and change. So we have Dr. Nathan Archer as one of our speakers, kicking off the conference with his keynote all around advocacy and activism in early childhood, followed by the rest of our brilliant speakers on the day, who are Adam Marriage, who will be discussing leading your team through Ofsted inspections, Dr. Stella Louis, talking about school readiness and intellectual readiness, a question of balance, Ben Kingston Hughes, exploring the power of play, Dr. Valerie Daniel, creative pedagogical practices to encourage agency, Ruth Swales, unpicking how do we construct our own curriculum, Helen Bately, talking about the foundations of early writing, and a special feature from Dr. Sue Allingham, Dr. Sue's Surgery, which you can book into throughout the day. This is an opportunity for a one-to-one Q&A session with Dr. Sue, so really make the most of this special feature by coming prepared with your burning questions, whether this may be around practice, leadership, Ofsted perhaps, or anything else you can think of, you can ask Dr. Sue. We also have a whole conference discussion which is focused on sustainability in early childhood in the widest sense. So we'll be focusing on sustainable development goals, which we will discuss, debate, and really unpick what this means for early childhood and our responsibility as educators within this. Linked to this, there will be a student posters showcase around the Sustainable Development Goals, where we can engage in more discussion and reflections, really focusing on linking theory and academia to practice. So there's lots in store for you on this really exciting day. And as always, you can expect on our conference day opportunities for shared reflection, discussion, and healthy debate, valuable CPD, a diverse range of speakers, a safe space to share your practice and thoughts, a relaxed atmosphere, plenty of opportunities for networking, a selection of exhibitor stands to explore and ask questions, and of course, fantastic food and refreshments as always. And for 2024, we really had to step it up a notch with a choice of workshops, so a leadership or a practice strand to choose from, a start of the day and an end of the day keynote, interactive sessions, and of course our Q&A with Dr. Sue, which is new. So if this sounds like the kind of conference and early childhood community that you would like to be part of, then grab your tickets before they sell out. We do have limited capacity. And if you haven't already heard, you can get 10% off to use at checkout by signing up to our newsletter. I've added the link in this episode description where you can sign up for your code, find more info about the conference and speakers, and access our Eventbrite page to secure your ticket. So I will see you in March. So then we didn't have the need for that training, is what you're saying. So I'm just thinking about those kind of external professionals that come in and do training, like sports coaches, because there is that in early years too, as well as in primary schools. So what you were saying earlier, they're teaching those very specific sports specific skills, and actually that's not helpful because the children haven't laid those foundations. So it's almost like that being an intervention, it shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be what schools and nurseries are seeking out. They should be seeking out the training to train up their practitioners in order to support children and create these interventions, almost interventions themselves, if children are already delayed.
Yeah, I mean, so the ideal scenario for us is that we sort of work hopefully with local authorities who support some of this, and then a cluster. So the ideal scenario is a cluster of schools with their with their feeder preschools and nurseries, and we have a level 3 training which is targeted at nursery and preschools that looks more at smaller groups, little numbers, more snippets. It doesn't have the level of assessment, because a lot of the stuff they just like, I don't want to be writing it, I don't want to be reading that stuff and writing an essay. I want to know. So we work with the preschools on a different training, but it's the same principles about analyzing movement and laying it. So then those children, right from the nursery, those staff are understanding the importance. They're making sure that those children are developing that core stability. They're having those balance opportunities. They're building that body management and broad vocabulary. They're getting lots of little manipulation, rolling skills, eye tracking activities. They're starting to lay those foundations, and then they feed into the foundation phase, which in Wales is 3 in the schools. They go in at 3, 4, and the staff there and their TAs are also trained. So there's this beautiful, consistent messaging saying, oh, wow. And then, there's a parent piece on that, which is parents getting the messaging. And one of some of the staff in one of the schools we worked at up on the east part of Wales, in Newport, in the big cities there, and they said, oh, it's funny, the parents were coming in going, oh, I've been told off that we can't walk in the buggy today because they've been doing it, and the mums were laughing, saying, we've been told we've got to walk up to school. And so there's that feed in that the children are saying, oh, we've got to move more, but it's consistent messaging, and then, because if we don't get that, what we get is the children put into a sport scenario that they're just not ready. And that's when they're going, well, I'm not bringing my kit next week. I'm 8 years old. I can't yet. Why would I go and fail? Because I guess one of the big differences with the physical part of learning is that it's always on show, isn't it? Like if in other academic areas, you're not so good in your language or your maths, it's hidden in a book and only you and your teacher know that. Whereas in the physical session, you're in a physical space, and if you can't catch a ball, then everybody can see that. So I think that's why when you look at Susan Haar's work and you look at that, the physical self-perception is actually one of the strongest drivers of self-esteem. So we really need to get that right. And we're not saying we're turning anyone into Olympic athletes or but we want everyone to feel like a proficient mover and have these basic generic skills which enable them, if they want to choose those activities. They may not want to, but for me, it's our responsibility is to lay the foundations that give every child a choice, and protects them from that awful downward spiral of I'm not a mover, I'm out of here. And we talk to a lot of adults who will say, oh, I hated PE in school, and it breaks my heart, because I think, well, you didn't have a good experience then, did you? Because if those foundations have been laid correctly and you've been given really lovely positive experiences, because a lot of these adults are finding things to do. They're going walking, they're walking the dog, they're joining gyms, they're going swimming, they're doing things, but they've come at it, they weren't having those things nurtured all the way through, which they should have had. So for me, it's, if we get this piece right in early childhood, we've ticked a massive box that we really have to get right. That then allows children as they get older to have, and again, for me, they should have lovely, rich, varied movement experiences in physical education, not just sport. I'm not anti-sport in any way, but for me, it's like if a school said we're only going to do poetry in our English, that's all we're doing, every class of English, the parents would be in uproar. But no one, it's like but all we do is sport. In PE, sport's just one tool. The movement should be beautiful, rich. There should be creative movement. There should be outdoors. There should be that lovely, rich experience of moving in lots of different contexts, not just giving what would be nothing against poetry either, but there'd soon be an outcry, wouldn't there, if it's all we did? Or if we gave children Wordsworth when they were 6 to look at, we'd be like, what are you doing? And yet I do hear stories of, we'll go in and do football with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. Like, well, they're not a proficient mover yet. They're not ready to learn sport techniques. Let's get them beautifully proficient in all this lovely movement vocabulary, and then they're going to love whatever sport they choose and flourish in that, or more likely to. So
I think when you term it as movement vocabulary, then it brings so many kind of opportunities to think about the vastness of movement and physicality, that it's not just physical development and sport, it's actually a whole, like you said, a vocabulary. So it almost puts it into that academic lens, this is important. Unfortunately, we kind of see things in that way. I was just also going to pick up on when you said that, having that healthy physical development essentially, and all the kind of more detailed things that you're talking about, gives children a choice. But it's not even necessarily that, it's giving them a choice of having an active lifestyle. Hopefully they will have a healthy lifestyle and choose that, but it's that choice of having a good start to reading and all these things that you were saying earlier. It's just having a good start to life, isn't it, generally?
Yeah.
And it's not about preparing them for school. There's a lot of kind of conversations around that rhetoric of preparing them for the future, but it's about making sure that they are successful in whatever that means for them, and they have a good start in life, and they have all of these choices and opportunities, rather than being delayed and struggling with self-esteem.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I mean, if you think about that physicality and that early part where children, if they can't hold their head and they can't focus, they can't read nonverbal body language, how can they understand when they've said things that are inappropriate? How can they fit in socially? So we know that children who struggle with movement and struggle with those that core stability and eye tracking, their social skills are often not as good. Their speech and language is not as good. So it helps with all of that. And it's about, I guess, people understanding the absolute importance of movement. And for us, we need to roll it back even further, really. Parents need to do that. And we do. I mean, we're very lucky, we're very privileged. We work across sectors. So we work with people now in the health boards in the community. So we're applying those principles into that. We do, we work with sports. We worked with the FAW. I talked about football with 3-year-olds, but ironically, we've run a program called Footy Families, but it does exactly what we said. It couches it in the sort of frame of football, but it's about a broad movement vocabulary and preparing those children to choose, if they want to choose football when they're ready, but they could choose a whole range of sports. But it's also about the parents playing with those children and them learning and valuing. And I think there's also a beautiful social interaction that happens with a parent when they're playing those physical games. When if you've thrown a ball or rolled a ball at a child and they've caught it, they're so excited. They're so happy, they feel amazing. And knowing how you can empower your child to learn to be successful in those physical skills really, really helps them with their confidence and their social interaction. And, we work a lot with parents. We, as a university, we've worked together in partnership and created a support for parents, which is like a little app that they can use called Mini Movers. And, to see, and parents report to us, oh, wow, it's just fun. They ask in it. We have so much fun playing it. It builds the children's confidence, so we're seeing that. And ideally, if we could get parents to get the message before they come into our early childhood settings, then again, we're stopping that erosion early on, so it's a very big picture. It's a very big challenge because society encourages, us to be able to sit down and have a screen and and that's parents are very busy and there's a lot of gadgets. And so it is very difficult, but I don't think a parent gets up in the morning and goes, I'm going to delay my child, so I'm going to strap them in this buggy. And, they don't realize the consequences of what's happening along the way. But for us, I guess, it's just encouraging when we hear practitioners and teachers talking about children are more confident, children are calmer, because I think what people don't realize is stillness is a skill. So you can't, if your balance system isn't integrated into your motor system, you can't sit still. So those children with a poorly developed balance system, so they still haven't sussed that out, not saying that they won't, but children develop at all different rates. So the children that need more vestibular system, they tend to be more fidgety, they charge around, they spin about more, they're just processing that information more. So as children do more rich movement, they are ready to sit and be calmer. So it's a real win for they're like, oh, wow, we've done this amazing and are more engaged. We've built physicality into things, and oh gosh, the children are calmer and more ready to learn when we need to sit down and be calmer. So it's a win-win. And
and it really is all about understanding and having that knowledge of child development, because when you kind of say that in terms of when I've been outside and then they're calmer, just generally the message, I guess, in society is that let children run around outside for a bit and then they'll calm down, they'll tire themselves out, and then they'll be calm. And actually that's all we hear. But yes, that might be the case. Generally they're tired, so they're going to kind of be a little bit calmer because they don't have as much energy. But there's so much more to running around outdoors, or doing certain skills outdoors, or not even outdoors or indoors, just moving, and like you say, having that broad movement vocabulary. There's so much more to it for so many reasons than just they've tired themselves out or they're just calm. There's so
Yeah.
many reasons behind that.
Yeah. So when we talk about
Mm.
physical activity in our world, we talk about quality movement experiences. And that's very different to like counting our steps or ticking off it's not
Yeah.
that much around. We don't reduce movement to just getting a distance or
Any
counting
movement.
steps. No, we're talking about very rich developmental movement. So yes, playing outside is amazing because there's all a range of affordances. And the reason it's so amazing is because children will be challenging their balance in different ways. They'll be tending to climb more, taking weight on different parts of their bodies, experiencing a multi-set. So, and it's all of that, balance opportunities, being upside down, moving around in different contexts, which is what actually is helping to wire those systems together. Whereas if they're just charging around on a flat surface in a yard, getting tired out, that's not necessarily improving the vestibular system, which isn't going to, it's that vestibular maturity and the wiring of a core that means you can sit calmly and hold yourself with good posture and with attention and focus on someone, because I can do all of that because I've wired it all together. That teachers say, oh yeah, they're calm and ready to learn. It's like, yeah, because you've now built in all those beautiful, rich movement experiences. And for us in Wales, we have a play-based approach in those foundation learning years. So, a really important part is understanding those play cues that children use. And a big win for us is that when you look at the work of people like Howard and McGuinness, who've analysed children's interpretation of whether things are play and work, one of the things children use to judge whether it's play or not is whether it's physical. So
okay, that's really interesting.
It's and it's doubly interesting because if children interpret something as play, they're more focused in it, they're more involved in that learning, and so the learning is better. So it's a massive. So we're teaching the teachers to understand the importance of physicality and how they can set up really good quality movement experiences in the hall, but also how can I build that into my moving in other areas of learning. For example, we would say to them, well, do a maths trail outside because you're going to be developing some good, rich locomotor experiences. Put the things that they're over different surfaces, because not only are they doing their mathematical development and looking at the problems on that, or collecting things like, the little, is it that, what are they called? Those pneumicon shapes or whatever they built.
Yeah.
Not only are they collecting that and doing their number bonds to 10, but they're also traveling on different surfaces, crawling under things, over things, developing those systems. So they're learning, they'll think it's play and they'll be more engaged in it. So that's a massive win for them as well. But also, it's about understanding then for us with object control skills, there's the layer of, well, while you're outside and you might be doing like a throwing activity with bean bags into hoops to collect numbers and make those number bonds to 10, are you also able to give them a cue to help them step with opposition? Because that's what they need to learn to throw. So we're giving them so that they're doing an outdoor activity that's physical, that children will interpret as play. They're doing a mathematical development activity, but the teacher is also then able to support them with the skill of throwing as an object control skill, because they're seeing it through that lens. So it's like it's just, to me, it's like a no-brainer. It's a win-win on every level. So, yeah, we're very pleased with it.
Well, yeah, I can see that when you talk about it, it really, everything does seem to make sense. It's like a puzzle, kind of suddenly all the pieces come together, and that is all helped by having that knowledge and understanding. And like you say, this is why the professional development program is so important, and continuous professional development is vital, but it's not just about going on one training course or watching one webinar. It needs to be a lot more kind of solidified and rounded than that.
It needs to be embedded into practice. And we did, we've tried those, and we're not the only people, there's lots of research that shows that one-shot workshops don't change practice. We know that people leave, they're really enthused and they might change something for a few days, but you go back weeks later and they've reverted back to practice. It's not enough, particularly in something as challenging as the physical learning domain. We really need to give people the confidence to implement this, and then reflect on it and then come back and have that built up. So yeah, it is. We know that workshops that aren't built over time, that don't embed things, won't change practice. And you asked me right at the beginning about my research. We continue to research it. So as we do our training, we continue to go in and test children's motives, because for me, my work is I head an applied research academy. So everything about what I do is the research being applied to practice, but is it still actually working? Because if I'm training teachers and preschool staff and they're not improving the children's outcomes, then there's no point in doing it. So we also, not only do we gather data from teachers about the experience and how they're finding it, but we also test the children on a regular basis and say, well, is that actually improving their physical skills still? Because that's, at the end of the day, those children need to be learning to move better. They need to be developing good core, good balance, good locomotor and good object control skills to underpin it. Otherwise, so yeah, so we do that all the time just to make sure, because for me, it's there are lots of training programs out there, and over the years we've done things very differently, but this, we feel like there's no point in investing in this unless it's changing an outcome for a child, because at the end of the day, we have got a chronic problem of it. We know that we are going to see, and whenever I see those things reported in the media, I'm like, well, it doesn't surprise me to see that number of children inactive, because we still haven't nailed this issue in the early childhood window, and that's what we've got to do. So and
that's where it all begins. Well, thank you for sharing your research with us. It does sound really fascinating in terms of how global kind of the issues are, but actually how much can be done to really support, close that motor skill gap, by giving practitioners, educators and parents the knowledge and also the confidence, like you say, about putting it into practice. So I think it's probably a good place to kind of wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Dr. Nalda. And listeners can find out more on the Voice of Early Childhood website, of course. And if you did enjoy this episode, you'll also enjoy Josh Candy's episode and article on PE in early years, which is also really interesting. And there might be some things to kind of unpick there. And, after listening to this episode as well, to kind of think, okay, how do things make sense? There might be some kind of critical thinking and reflections to be had there. And also Dr. Alan Manar's article series and podcast episode on unpicking physical development in terms of the early learning goals here in England. So again, just really interesting to hear different approaches across, the UK, and like we were saying as well, it's a global kind of issue anyway. So lots to unpick from this episode, lots to reflect on. So thank you very, very much once again, Dr. Nalda, and I'm sure we'll hear from you again and read lots from you as well.
Thank you.